Welcome to the chaos sector. Let's continue with our focus on gun control. In today's episode, we examine a panel discussion on Piers Morgan's show regarding gun control. His guests are Van Jones and NRA representatives Dana Lash and Grover Norquist. Now this debate gets really absurd, but the key factor in the debate is what can be done about so-called mass shootings. Remember, the semi-automatic rifle will always be prevalent in the gun control debate. Let's get started.
Van Jones, I just spoke against Richard Feldman, who was pretty close to the NRA leadership for quite a while, and the message is loud and clear from the NRA, as it always is. More guns, and you'll deal with gun violence. What do you say to that?
Well, I just think people are just flabbergasted to hear this. I mean, the idea that the kind of gun, the size of gun, the kind of magazines, none of this matters, well, then fine. Just pass out bazookas. Start selling neutron bombs on the open market. And then when people start using the bazookas and doing crazy, say, well, it's not the bazooka owner. You see, it's just, it's not the bazooka, it's just the bazooka owners. Obviously, the size of the cartridge matters. Obviously, the kind of weapon matters. That's why you can't buy bazookas, you can't buy neutron bombs, you can't buy weaponized drones, because these things matter. It's very, very frustrating. The shame that I see right now is that, on the one hand, we're not doing enough about mental health, but then we have people who are hiding behind the fact that we're not doing one thing to stop us from doing anything else, and that's wrong, too.
Now Van Jones had a very logical analysis, which is complimented. He also mentioned mental health, which is a talking point on the right, but it's not just about mental health. You have to take all necessary preventive measures to stop the so-called mass shootings, right? This debate will become very erratic, due to two of the guests being representatives of the NRA. There is no compromise from their side, so obviously the debate is headed for a brick wall.
I mean, Marco Rubio says today he's warned that he will filibuster any new gun legislation. Dana Lash, how can that be an appropriate response to what happened at Sandy Hook?
Well, simply, Piers, because we have gun laws already on the books. Most of the proposals are simply redundancy. That's why. Why are we paying individuals to go and essentially waste taxpayer dollars to argue laws that we already have on the books, laws which either aren't enforced or criminals don't obey them simply because that's what criminals don't do. Criminals are called criminals because they don't follow law.
Yeah, very slithery. She cunningly tiptoed around the issue. The reason Piers asked her that question is due to the so-called mass shooting of Sandy Hook. It is not a waste of time to argue gun legislation after a so-called massacre just occurred. Now think about this for a moment. A so-called massacre just happened, and Dana suggests it is pointless to discuss any proposal for new gun legislation because there are already gun laws on the books. That's exactly why you are arguing, to find a solution and adjust those gun laws on the books so the so-called massacre won't happen again, or at least reduce the likelihood it would. Do you see how apathetic she appears? Instead, she should say, quote, I'm for improved gun legislation, perhaps more extensive screening of individuals attempting to purchase semi-automatic rifles. That would help prevent a lot of these massacres. But we have to be careful with gun laws, because when you give the federal government the authority to directly impact our constitutional rights, who knows where that will end. Unquote. That perspective would show Lash has empathy and does genuinely want to prevent the so-called mass shootings, but she can also hold on to her little, quote, patriotism in criticizing the federal government. But no, she would rather go full dirt mode and choose not to compromise in the debate. A gun nut. A gun nut is someone who is literally obsessed with guns, to the point they have lost all sense of reality and what is happening in the world. They only care about their rights to have those guns, not the society falling apart around them due to the gun violence.
Right, so Adam Lanza had 2 rifles, a BB gun, a starter pistol, 4 more weapons he took to school, including the AR-15, 1,600 rounds of ammunition in his house, 12 knives, 3 samurai swords, a bayonet, eye protection, ear muffs for gun range, Simmons binoculars, paper targets, etc., etc., etc. And he went and did what he did. At what point, Dana, do you say, you know what, we're just going to make it tougher for people to be able to have this kind of arsenal?
Well, Piers, you realize that Adam Lanza, according to the LA Times, the Portland Observer, numerous local media reports in Connecticut, he did try to purchase a firearm. And Connecticut's gun laws prohibited him from doing that. Those gun laws worked in the sense that they prohibited him from purchasing a firearm. Now, as to whether or not his mother should have had her firearms perhaps stored a little bit better and kept away from her son, that's another topic of discussion. But, again, he stole firearms. He committed a crime to obtain a firearm, which he then used illegally.
Oh, okay, let's revisit that hoax. Lanza attempted to purchase a rifle at a local gun store, but was turned away because he didn't want to wait for the 14-day background check period. Lash didn't mention that part, and here's why. When he was turned away, because he was impatient, the local gun store owner would notify the local authorities that an individual came into his store and wanted to purchase a rifle, but was acting impatient. Suspicion is the focus here. The local authorities contact the FBI, there's that agency again, and the FBI will monitor the individual for some time. And guess what they did? Exactly that. The FBI monitored Lanza's internet activity, discovering he would call into a radio show for anarchists. Anarchists? That's it for you, buddy, you're going on the FBI's watch list. Once on a watch list, his every move is tracked. In a nutshell, impossible to do what he did. Just wanted to point that out. But Dana Lash is trying to rationalize everything, to suggest the so-called mass shooting only happened because Lanza stole the guns. Yeah, nice try, that doesn't change the fact that guns were used, especially the gun that is taking center stage in the so-called mass shootings.
Trevor Norquist, you're on the board of the NRA, and the NRA, it seems to me, has a lot of very reasonable members, many of whom tweet me, and if you're watching now, you want to tweet me, at Piers Morgan, let me know if you're an NRA member, and they're quite rational, and they say, look, we have no real problem with background checks. We don't have any problem with more investment in mental health and so on. Not even much of a problem with the high-capacity magazines. They're not too sure about assault weapons, but they're quite rational in what they say. But the leadership always seemed to me to be, particularly Wayne LaPierre, completely outrageous, utterly insensitive, totally uncompromising. Why is that?
Well, I think if you look at the history of gun laws, make a list of which cities and states have the most oppressive gun laws. You'll find they also have more crime and more shootings.
With so-called oppressive gun laws, how are there more shootings? Simple, he is suggesting that the criminals are free to run around with guns, while the law-abiding citizen is the one being targeted. Nice talking point against the left, but it's another deflection tactic. And what, quote, oppressive gun laws, is he referring to? The only thing that comes to mind is some states require the citizen to be at least 21 years of age to purchase a pistol. Now they can purchase a, quote, long gun, at the age of 18, which is classified as a hunting rifle. He would suggest, the criminals, who are also 18, are running around with pistols, why can't a law-abiding 18-year-old purchase that same pistol? Nice try, but how can you determine if that 18-year-old is law-abiding? What if they are a few physical encounters from bringing that pistol to school, to so-called shoot one of their bullies? The criminal possesses the gun illegally, they purchased it on the street somewhere. It's literally apples and oranges. Notice how he didn't provide any evidence of this so-called oppressive gun law? Because what he considers oppressive is actually common sense. Do a bit of research for yourself, because this is primarily what he calls, quote, oppressive. There are of course waiting periods, such as the aforementioned 14-day background check, which is very important, right? These are considered oppressive procedures when purchasing a firearm? Really?
There's actually, if you look at the science, liberals are always saying we should look at the science, and yet they don't want to look at the existing science on whether gun laws make us safer or less safe. John Lott did the first study of all the counties in the United States, and where you had concealed carry permits, more gun ownership by citizens, you actually had significantly less crime.
He had to clear his throat, because that is a straw man argument. In context, the focus of the debate is about gun violence, but essentially, this debate is about so-called mass shootings. Norquist knows very well what the point is. We can suggest that the cities or communities in which the so-called mass shootings occurred were not ravaged with crime or even gun violence. Those were relatively safe communities as well, before being terrorized by a so-called mass shooter. He is using the common gun violence in communities that have high crime rates to indirectly challenge the point about assault rifles used in so-called mass shootings. Because he knows if he addresses the so-called mass shootings directly, he would have to discuss the actual gun itself that's being used. Piers would be able to chip away at his stance, he's been here before. Debating gun control with the likes of Ben Smartmouth Shapiro and wacky disinfo agent Alex Jones, Piers has held his own regarding this topic. In fact, we can say that he made the more valid points about gun rights.
Hundreds and thousands of fewer murders, fewer rapes. What you don't have reported in the news is the fact that those states that put in concealed carry laws decades ago and have more people carrying guns are safer to live in than ones that ban it. So when you ask, why don't we do something stupid, the answer is because we've looked at the statistics, because we've looked at the science, and flat earthers should not be passing new laws.
Hold on, flat earthers? What is that about? You believe the Earth is round? Answer this question, can you prove the Earth is round without going into space to view the Earth being round? No. What other so-called evidence can you prove the Earth is round without using what NASA so-called shows you? NASA faked a moon landing, haven't been to the moon whatsoever. The same fake landing of yesterday has simply evolved into CGI images and computer animation, fooling people into thinking they've traveled to outer space. And why is it so dark in so-called outer space, if you are literally closer to the sun, which lights up an entire planet so far away? No images of the sun in outer space? Is the sun sleeping or some shit? Oh, let me guess, the moon is only out at night in space, while the sun dims its rays down to regain energy. Get the flying fuck out of here.
Well, let me throw some science at you. How do you explain that, as I said to Mr. Feldman earlier, America has between 11 and 12,000 gun murders a year, 18,000 gun suicides a year, 100,000 Americans are hit by gunfire a year. And you look at somewhere like Britain, or you look at somewhere like Australia, or Japan, or I could name dozens of other countries that have pretty strict gun control laws and just have negligible gun deaths. I mean, literally, like 40 or 50 people a year get killed. How do you explain that, Grover, in any rational way that convinces me that countries that don't have guns in mass circulation have almost no gun crime?
Well, if you compare apples and apples and look in the United States, I mean, obviously Brazil and South Africa and other countries have a great number of gun crimes, and they have very serious gun laws. So gun laws haven't solved the problem in other countries. And where you've put in more gun laws in Australia and Britain, you've had more crime in general, more robberies, more crime. They've become less safe. Now, in the United States,
It's all subjective, because you have to focus on culture of a country. In America, more guns does not mean more safety. It could, but there is more impact of criminals with guns than law-abiding citizens with guns, obviously. For every one law-abiding gun owner who defended a fellow citizen, there are 5 citizens being murdered by criminals with guns. His suggestion, along with his wacky sidekick in Lash, is to push pro-gun rhetoric where every potential victim or target should have a firearm to protect themselves. Sounds logical at face value, but you forget one key point: the criminals still have guns. What is the solution in getting the guns out of the hands of criminals and the mentally ill? Clearly, the gun laws haven't worked, because there have been tons of so-called mass shootings. And this is the main focus of the debate, where Piers and Van are trying to come to a compromise and solution, while Norquist and Lash are simply defending the NRA until death do them part. That reluctance to accept any idea or plan creates an image of complicity. As long as I have my guns, I could care less what happens in communities or even schools.
compare the states, 50 or 57, however you want to count them. They've all got different gun laws.
Okay,
they have
Van,
different rules.
let me get Van in here. Let me get Van in here, because he's shaking his head vigorously. Van?
Yeah, first of all, that's just actually not true. But I want to say a couple things. This is
No, wait a
not
minute, it is
about
true.
concealed carry. Hold on a second. It's not true.
You can't
First of
deny
all,
the
this is
science.
not
You're
about-
a science denier, Van.
Are you going to let me talk? You got
Let's
a
not be
wonderful
flat
time
earthers
talking.
about gun
Can I
laws, guys, and statistics.
Lash is attempting to make a joke about flat earthers. Can she explain why the sun is not visible when NASA shows her outer space? Not even a glare in the distance. Listen, you dumbass, if the sun literally lights up the entire world, how is it not visible in outer space? Or, here's a better question, what lights up the moon? The moon gets its light from, drum roll, the sun. If the sun gives light to the moon, why can't you see the sun's light in the distance? The point, everything you are being so-called shown from outer space, is based on claiming the Earth is round. Stick to guns, because you and your other half are flat, out dumb as a bag of nickels.
This is not a debate about concealed carry. You want to move the argument over to something that nobody's arguing about. Nobody's arguing about concealed carry. People are arguing about military-style weapons on the streets of America and whether or not that is a good thing or a bad thing.
That's a false premise. That's a false premise.
No, that's not. It's a false premise.
Van, do you
That's
actually
the
know
entire
what the
debate
difference?
in
I'm going to correct
Washington,
you
D.C.
because
right now.
I'm tired of this talking point being put out there. First and foremost, let's get something straight. Military-style assault weapons are not out on the street. We are talking about semi-automatic weapons, weapons that are capable of select fire,
Okay,
or
well,
weapons that are fully
Dana,
automatic. Then you can use. No, I'm not going to let
guys
this
do
go
the
anymore,
same thing
Piers.
every
Dana,
time.
you said this repeatedly on my show.
You do
Let's
the same
stop
thing every
conflating.
time.
Let's stop playing about ignorance and let's stop conflating.
General Stanley McChrystal, General Stanley McChrystal used the phrase. So forget us, forget Van, forget me. One of the great
man who
military
bans
commanders of the
conservative
last
news in
20
his
years
headquarters, yes.
in America
We're well aware.
said these were military-style weapons. So is he wrong? Do you know more about these weapons than General McChrystal does?
General
Evidently,
McChrystal is
because-
also of your same ideology, so I want to put that out there first and foremost. There is a deliberate effort to conflate the types of firearms. I do not own a military-style assault weapon. Just because of what a firearm looks scary, then you call it military assault? Do you realize that one of my children has a BB gun that looks like an AR-15? Is that going to be considered a military-style assault weapon? It sounds silly and uneducated.
Adam Lanza killed. Wait a minute. Adam Lanza
And
killed.
it's dangerous.
Adam Lanza, as we now know, in the space of 300 seconds, using an AR-15, killed 26 people. Dana. He had
reloaded
magazines.
So
he had magazines with 30 bullets.
Yeah.
Are you telling me?
And he reloaded
are you
4
telling
times.
me that
Anyone
doesn't?
can reload.
Are you telling me that
Anyone
doesn't?
can reload.
Dana, let me finish. Are you telling me that doesn't qualify as an assault weapon?
By the technical definition, no, Piers. Oh, anything can be qualified as an assault weapon. If you stab someone with a spoon, it can be qualified as an assault weapon.
So you're equating stabbing somebody with a spoon to shooting dead 26 people
in 5 minutes. If this is a conversation about a ban on magazine capacity,
really? You're talking about stabbing somebody with a spoon?
Piers, you can take a speed loader and reload a revolver. 150 rounds, that means he had to reload 4 times. And the only reason that he stopped was because he heard authorities.
No,
Van, this is the strategy of the people who actually deliberately want to disarm individuals. You guys talk about magazine, you talk about magazine restrictions.
Okay, let Van have his say.
See, this is a conscious strategy on the part of the pro-gun folks to constantly bring things back around to things that don't make any sense. You're talking about people stabbing people with spoons. If that were the problem we had in America, people stabbing people with spoons, we wouldn't be talking about this right now. What we're talking about is funeral after funeral after funeral. What we're talking about is our children being gunned down, and what we're talking about is common sense measures, not confiscating guns. We're not talking about that. We're talking about common sense measures that 90% of Americans agree with and that the majority of gun owners agree with. But when you guys get on television, you don't talk like the people who actually are the gun owners in America. What you talk like are people who want to take the conversation in a direction that has nothing to do.
And by the way, CBS, the latest CBS poll shows that support for these gun control measures is tanking. This is about disarmament. Let me ask you. Yes, no. Let me finish my thought because I have a very logical thought that I'm going to let you answer. I'm tired of this conflation and this uneducation when it comes to using terms about firearms. Let's use accurate terms so that people know what we're talking about. If this is about limiting the number of children dying, let's talk about magazine capacity. Why, if 30-round magazine capacity isn't okay, then what's the difference between 30 rounds and what's the difference between 7 rounds? Piers Morgan, let me ask you a question.
This is absolutely bonkers. What's the difference between 30 rounds and 7 rounds? The fact that Lash even asked that question is enough to confirm she does not care about so-called mass shootings. Hypothetically, if the semi-automatic was mandated to carry a maximum of 7 rounds, doesn't this reduce the casualty rate in the so-called mass shootings? Lash simply won't accept this point because it compromises her political fight for the damn gun. Her partner in crime has left the building. As a board member for the NRA, he hasn't spoken a word since the exchange heated up. He knows it's getting out of hand with loudmouth Lash. As the board member of the NRA, he should step in and calm Lash down, because her ranting is really giving the NRA a black eye. And she is also showing a disregard for his position, because she should allow him to speak on behalf of the NRA more so.
How many children, how many deaths are okay to you? How many deaths are okay to you? Answer that question.
Let me ask you a question. The difference between 30 and 7 is 23. So it could save 23 lives if there was a federal
ban okay with
on any of these magazines.
7 lives lost are okay with you then.
And you actually, no, you know what, Dana?
Okay, I understand that. 7 lives lost are okay.
7 is better than 30.
7 lives lost to you are all right.
30 are okay with you.
Dana, it's better than losing 30. Yes, it is.
I'm just trying to establish where you draw the line. Where do you draw the line at preventing the deaths of children, Piers?
I would love to draw the line. I would love to draw the line. I would love to draw the line, Dana, at 0 gun deaths in America every year.
So you do believe in disarmament then?
I said 0 gun deaths. 0 gun deaths.
That's the answer that I wanted.
When did I say disarmament? No, wait a minute. You talk about conflating the argument.
Piers,
Dana, when did I say disarmament?
I'm taking it down. I'm using your logic and going down that road. If you're talking about limiting magazines, first and foremost, any magazines are universal. I can make one in my garage.
I said I wanted 0. I said I wanted 0 gun deaths.
Let's take that and throw that out. Okay,
let me finish. We have to go to a break, but you said I said I wanted 0 gun deaths. You announced that meant I wanted disarmament. That's the problem with the pro-gun debate. Let's take a break. Anyway, let's all calm down. Come back and talk about gay marriage. I'm sure.
I want to respond to Dana.
That's going to be even more lively, probably. So let's try that.
Absolute madness, but in the Matrix, it's all political entertainment to them. Yes, all of them. But for what it's worth, we witness the proof that the pro-gun advocates are more focused on guns than the impact those guns have on society. The goalpost was not only moved, it was completely carried off out of the stadium. Dana Lash sounded so ignorant and had the nerve to be condescending. I noticed Norquist stopped talking because he knew where to draw the line. Once the mention of assault rifles popped up, he zipped his lips really fast. Because he actually works for the NRA, and he dares say something that could compromise the integrity of that company. So he let Dana Lash ramble on, as she is more dispensable. She was a spokesperson for the NRA, but Norquist is a board member. 2 different roles, 2 different liabilities. And she apparently is no longer a spokesperson for them. I wonder why. Because of childish, ignorant, inflammatory behavior such as this. The NRA has enough to deal with, don't need some radical conservative adding fuel to their building fire. Every time a so-called school shooting happens, the NRA is the first to blame. In a way, it's not fair to them. The blame should initially go to the federal government. But due to the controversial figures who represent them, such as Dana Lash, of course everyone will point the finger at the NRA. It doesn't help that this Dana Lash is often plastering photos out of her holding assault rifles, or my mistake, semi-automatic rifles. It becomes more about pushing an agenda, more than defending your Second Amendment rights. At first though, they needed her, the spicy, no-nonsense conservative woman, pushing the narrative of a patriotism through defending gun rights. But she became too radical, not saying the right things, and saying the wrong things, at the wrong time also. This debate provided the left with more evidence, amongst all the other evidence, that the right are out of touch with reality. It's funny to hear me say that, as we usually say that about the left. But when it comes to the gun debate, the left will always have the upper hand. This is the chaos sector.